Goodfellas was the first film that Martin Scorsese had to test screen, and he got exactly the kind of negative responses that he wanted, and Warner Bros. Perhaps didn't. With the ending in particular, his aim was to annoy the audience. He wanted them to be agitated by Ray Liotta's character and his attitude and outlook on life. He'd say, I wanted to seduce everybody into the movie and into the style, and then just take them apart with it. I guess I wanted a kind of angry gesture. It's a different, more defiant stance to the one he had just over a decade earlier. He was told by George Lucas that his musical New York, New York could have a better chance at the box office if it had a happier ending. Scorsese simply resigned himself to a doomed fate, believing he would never make it in the film industry. He'd say, I knew that what the two characters had gone through in that film, I had gone through in my own life. And I knew I wouldn't be able to face myself or them if Bob De Niro and Liza Minnelli were to go off together. Scorsese said that it's a miracle the film makes any sense, especially after the initial 4.5-hour cut was brought down by around 2 hours. The film was made at the height of his drug addiction, and he said he was too high to properly sort the structure out. The film's production was a turbulent one. It started with an unfinished script that the director largely strayed away from, with improvisation from his actors. There were big, bulky, new Hollywood dramatic scenes about relationships, careers, just dramas of the time, in between these golden age style musical numbers. Yet his personal life was perhaps even more turbulent. Throughout production he was at the height, as I say, of his drug addiction, which not long after would see him hospitalised following an overdose. And he was having an affair with star Liza Minnelli, who felt out of her depth with the improv and method acting around her. She described the affair as having as many layers as a lasagna. Yet Scorsese's continued to encourage improvisation in his films. A good chunk of what made it into Goodfellas was improvised, especially from Joe Pesci, who was pretty much given free rein by the director for most of his scenes. Scorsese would say that most of the cast just had to trust Pesci. They couldn't fully understand where he was coming from, but that's because Pesci had grown up so close to the mob. He knew people who were associated with them growing up. Then you have Ed McDonald, who's only briefly in the film, but he's playing himself, recreating his exchanges with Henry and Karen Hill. And it's only because a location scout was in his office taking some pictures, and he jokingly, kind of casually said, I could play myself. An hour later, Nicholas Pileggi, who wrote the book the film is based on, Wise Guy, and co-wrote the screenplay, called him up and said, were you serious? Although while the screenplay was somewhat strayed away from at times, what was specifically referred to often was the storyboard-style script that Scorsese had created based on the intricate shots he'd envisioned when reading Wise Guy. He first read it on the set of The Colour of Money, which is perhaps why Tom Cruise was at one point considered for the lead role. But it's almost a storyboard-style script, a bit like what George Miller did for Mad Max Fury Road. Everything specifically mapped out, and that's because of all these intricate shots that the director had envisioned. And even then, there were some workarounds that we used. The Copacabana sequence, that tracking shot, only really exists in the way it does, because the production couldn't get permission to go in the short way. So from that, we get this glimpse into the access, the status of Henry's life, what he gets before being given the new best seats in the house. And that also happened to Scorsese. He and a friend would go to a club, they'd arrive early, get really good seats, and then the mob would arrive and get brand new seats put right in front of them so their view was blocked. While writing the screenplay, he would tell Pileggi to note down the names of bands and songs, forming scenes around them in his mind. One would roll into the other like a musical or montage, keeping that consistent pace. And of course, at this point, we have to point out the work of Scorsese's longtime editor, Thelma Schoonmaker. A brilliantly edited film, this. The needle drops throughout, they feel as if they're part of this cool, relaxed mindset that the Mafia have, the confidence and power that they hold themselves with. And the film was influenced by the swagger and collected attitude of the Rat Pack in Ocean's 11. It was a key influence on Goodfellas. And that's until the songs start to contrast more and more with the darkness, the fear, the violence on screen. Violence that was intentionally cold, unemotional, disconnected. There's a very matter-of-fact attitude to it, shown in almost all crimes in the film. In the book, it's described that to Jimmy, whacking people was just business, but Tommy got enjoyment out of it. Or even Henry Hill had casually committed so many crimes that he sometimes failed to recognise that he had even done so. To guys like Hill, it was just part of doing business. To Henry, shaving points on college basketball wasn't even illegal. He had never even thought to mention it. Scorsese saw the already fast-paced book as perfect to adapt into a 2.5-hour trailer, with some moments being trimmed or cut. The chapters about Hill's time in prison themselves could be their own film. And he wanted to start with a quite literal gunshot and get faster and faster from there until the life of the main character can no longer keep up with him and itself, and so starts to fall apart. That bleary-eyed rush as Hill struggles to keep charging ahead perhaps brings in to some kind of, well, not some kind of, a quite tenuous circle, Scorsese's before and after of the 80s. He described the 80s as being the worst decade for him personally, and there was plenty of turbulence for him going into it. And once he was through it, it slightly feels like the ending of Goodfellas is him addressing things falling apart in his own life, with the film itself being that confident. He somewhat disparagingly described New York, New York as a $10 million home movie, but he'd referred to Goodfellas as a mob home movie, in relation to how it portrayed the day-to-day of the mafia. Part of his mind remembered growing up, sitting in a room crammed with his extended family, seeing the conversations in the neo-realist Italian films on TV, reflected in the people around him just talking over it, almost being mirrored. He felt a particular connection to the ending of Bicycle Thieves as a child after a local mob figure decided that a neighbourhood dispute should have ended with Scorsese's family just moving to another neighbourhood. And I think there are elements of Goodfellas that sort of make for the flip side of Bicycle Thieves. I wouldn't be surprised if it was a film that was also on his mind while he was making it. Out of the 80s, having had to build himself back up, prove himself multiple times throughout the decade, far from the personal turmoil of the late 70s and early 80s, and with his passion project, The Last Temptation of Christ, finally made, Scorsese was truly back with cool confidence and maybe a slight reflection on the journey that it took to get there. And so everyone, please sit back, relax, and enjoy from the very first gunshot, Goodfellas.